Back in the 1300s, people went to bed feeling fine, and sometimes didn't wake up. Fever struck without warning, painful swellings appeared, and entire families could be gone in just days. Church bells rang non-stop, streets stood empty, graveyards couldn't keep up. Across Europe, people began to wonder, was this the end of the world? What they didn't know was that the Black Death, the deadliest plague in human history, was spreading fast, killing up to half the population and changing life forever. Once it began, there was no escaping it. To understand the devastation that followed, we must first understand the heights from which humanity fell. The early 14th century was not a time of darkness and stagnation as it is often portrayed. It was the apex of the High Middle Ages, a period of remarkable stability, a population explosion, and a web of interconnectedness that Europe had not seen since the Roman Empire. Thanks to a climatic phenomenon called the medieval warm period, Europe had enjoyed bountiful harvests for generations. Over the course of 2 centuries, Europe's population had nearly doubled, and cities were spilling beyond their ancient Roman walls. Paris, Florence, Venice, and London. Cities alive with trade, culture, and ambition. Chaotic, densely packed hives of human activity. The Gothic cathedrals soared into the sky. Symbols of a people who felt closer to God, and more technologically advanced than any generation before them. More importantly, Europe and the wider world was connected. In Venice, a merchant could purchase silk that had journeyed across the entire continent of Asia, without leaving the safety of trade routes secured by the Mongol Empire. This was the Pax Mongolica, a vast network connecting the known world, the medieval World Wide Web, carrying spices, gold, and knowledge across the world. Ideas and technology traveled across continents at unprecedented speed. A glorious, bustling, optimistic world, full of promise and possibility. Yet this web of connection was a double-edged sword. The very caravans and ships that carried silk, gold, and ideas would soon carry a force that would change the world forever. The infrastructure for a global disaster was already in place. A society that seemed invincible was about to confront an enemy it could not see. Humanity could neither comprehend it, nor defend against it. The source of the coming apocalypse was far away. Thousands of miles from the cobblestone streets of Paris, in the endless, windswept steppes of Central Asia. The plague likely originated in what is now Kyrgyzstan or northern China, a land of extremes, where endless grasslands stretch to the horizon, harsh winters and blistering summers. Here, an ancient biological agent had existed for millennia.
Yersinia pestis,
a bacterium of ruthless efficiency, endemic to the burrowing rodents of the steppes, marmots, and ground squirrels. For centuries, the bacterium coexisted quietly, its hosts far from the bustling towns of humans. But in the 1330s, the fragile balance of the steppes was shattered. A period of ecological stress, perhaps a severe drought, then heavy rains, wiped out the rodents' food. Driven by hunger, infected rodents moved closer to human settlements, their fleas hitching a deadly ride. In the bustling trading outposts of the Silk Road, the first humans were infected. They could not understand what was happening, only that they were burning with fever, vomiting, and the agonizing swellings in the lymph nodes. Bubonic, that would give the plague its name. In the ancient world, news traveled slowly, yet the whispers of disaster moved faster than any merchant caravan. By the early 1340s, disturbing rumors began arriving at Mediterranean ports. Traders spoke quietly of whole civilizations disappearing in the east. Fire from the sky, disease, regions left abandoned. India, Tartary, Mesopotamia, people across Europe listened in fear. Yet with a sense of distance, these disasters felt far away, perhaps even punishment from God. They had no understanding of germs or disease. They never imagined that the spices on their tables were moving along the same routes as the thing that would destroy them. And at the center of the story, the Crimean Peninsula, jutting into the northern Black Sea, here stood the magnificent city of Caffa. Caffa was more than just a town. It was a heavily fortified, wealthy colony of the Republic of Genoa, a pivotal point linking the overland Asian trade routes. to the maritime networks of the Mediterranean. Within its thick stone walls lived Italian merchants, Armenian traders, and a diverse mix of peoples, all guarded by Genoese crossbowmen. In 1346, Caffa came under siege. The formidable army of the Golden Horde, a successor of the Mongol Empire, commanded by Khan Johnny Beg, encircled the city. The Genoese excelled in defense and maritime supply, and the siege stretched on for months, locked in a brutal stalemate. Then an unseen killer began to haunt the Mongol camps. The army, packed tightly with poor sanitation, became the ideal environment for the bacterium they had brought from the east. Soldiers began perishing by the hundreds, then thousands, their bodies blackened with gangrene before death. The Mongol force was disintegrating, not from combat, but from disease. Watching his army crumble and facing certain defeat, Genghis Khan made a terrible choice that would alter the course of history. In an act of desperate, calculated psychological and biological warfare, he commanded the corpses of his plague-stricken soldiers to be hoisted onto trebuchets. For days the sky above Caffa poured down dead bodies. Bodies crashed onto roofs and into the crowded market squares. The Genoese defenders watched in horror as disease quietly spread through the city. The once unbreachable fortress had been broken from within. Panic gripped Caffa, the wealthy Genoese merchants. Realizing their city was doomed, they turned to their most trusted asset, their ships. 12 Genoese galleys filled with refugees, cargo and hidden stowaways slipped away from the harbor, fleeing past the dying Mongol army, seeking safety far from the city. They sailed through the Bosphorus, past Constantinople, which itself would soon fall to the plague, and into the open Mediterranean. This sea was the engine of Europe's economy, a hub of fast-moving, intense trade. The fleeing ships became carriers of death, docking at major ports to resupply, unaware they were spreading the infection at every stop. The first major European port to be struck was Messina in Sicily. When the Genoese galleys arrived, the dock workers who sailed out to receive them were met with a scene from hell. Chroniclers of the time wrote that most of the sailors were dead, their bodies decaying on the decks. The few who remained alive were delirious, writhing in pain, covered with dark boils, oozing blood and pus. The authorities of Messina realized, too late, the true nature of the cargo. They ordered the ships driven away. But the real carriers of the disease, the black rats, common on medieval ships, and the fleas riding on them, had already crawled down the mooring ropes onto the docks. Messina became Europe's first test, and it failed disastrously. The speed of the disease was terrifying. The cramped living conditions of a medieval port city worked like fuel on a fire. Within weeks, the social order of Messina collapsed. People escaped the city for the countryside, only spreading the sickness farther across the island. Word of the Great Plague spread, and other ports tried to shut their harbors to ships arriving from the east, but medieval quarantine was far from perfect. Greed often defeated caution. A ship loaded with valuable spices could often pay its way into port. By early 1348, the great maritime republics were beginning to collapse. Genoa, the home port of the ships from Caffa, was ravaged. Venice, the queen of the Adriatic, faced an existential danger. The Venetians, the most pragmatic of merchants, eventually created the concept of the Lazaretto Islands in the lagoon set aside as quarantine zones, where arriving ships and crews had to wait 40 days. 40 giorni before entering the city. It was a groundbreaking public health measure. But for the first wave it was far too little too late. The gondoliers of Venice turned into funeral barges, stacking bodies high as they moved through the silent canals. From the Italian ports, the disease spread west to Marseille, the great gateway to France, and crossed the Adriatic to Dubrovnik. The coastal perimeter of Europe had been broken. Now the disease moved inland, as the plague traveled away from the coasts. Following river barges along the Rhone and carts along Roman roads, it encountered the densely populated heart of medieval Europe. Cities like Paris, Florence, London, and Barcelona were walled enclosures of twisting narrow streets. Multi-story timber houses that blocked out the sun. and open sewers running through the middle of the streets. They were incredibly lively, prosperous places, but hygienically they were tinderboxes waiting for a spark. When the plague struck a major metropolis, it didn't only kill people, it killed the city itself as a working organism. We must understand the terror of facing this without modern science. The greatest minds of the 14th century, the physicians of the University of Paris, were confused. Their framework was not germ theory, but the ancient Greek ideas of humours and miasma. They believed the air itself had become corrupted, perhaps by a particular planetary alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345, that released poisonous vapors from the Earth. Doctors advised people not to bathe, because it opened the pores to the corrupted air. They burned fragrant woods, like juniper and rosemary, at street corners to fight the smell of death. They bled patients already weakened by illness. They cut open the buboes, which only spread the septicemic infection faster. Every rational effort to stop the disease only seemed to worsen it. The realization that their best knowledge was useless created a deep psychological crisis. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the destruction of Florence, a city that lost perhaps 60% of its population, left us chilling descriptions of the social collapse. The fear of contagion was so great that the most sacred bonds of humanity were broken. Boccaccio wrote of fathers abandoning sons, wives leaving husbands to die alone in their beds. The sick were sealed inside their homes. The complex machinery of medieval life stopped. Laws were ignored because there were no magistrates to enforce them. Courts closed, bakeries stopped baking. The sounds of a busy carts, shouting merchants, construction, were replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the constant ringing of church bells, until the bell ringers themselves died, or officials banned the bells to prevent panic. The dead accumulated faster than they could be buried. The sacred ground of churchyards became filled, leading to the excavation of enormous plague pits, trenches where bodies were piled like firewood, layer upon layer covered with a thin layer of soil. In the 14th century, there was no separation between the physical world and the spiritual realm. An event of this scale could only be seen as direct, divine punishment, God punishing humanity for its many sins of greed, pride, and corruption. The Church, the foundation of medieval life, faced an impossible trial. People rushed to cathedrals, praying for salvation, gathering together in processions. That only helped spread the respiratory, pneumonic form of the plague even faster. When prayers failed, and priests died just as quickly as sinners, a desperate and extreme devotion appeared. The flagellant movement spread across northern Europe. Groups of hundreds of men dressed in identical robes walked from town to town twice a day. In the public square, they would strip to the waist and lash themselves with leather scourges, tipped with iron spikes, drawing blood in a public act of penance, hoping to carry the sins of the world upon their own bodies and appease the wrath of God. They were a frightening sight, spreading religious panic wherever they moved. But as the death toll rose, the desire for a concrete scapegoat grew darker. If God was not paying attention, perhaps the devil was at work. A horrifying conspiracy theory began, especially in the Holy Roman Empire and regions of Spain, claiming that Jewish communities were poisoning the wells of Christendom to exterminate the faithful. Despite formal denouncements of these claims by Pope Clement V, who emphasized that Jews were succumbing to the plague just as fast as Christians, mob hysteria took hold, fueled by centuries of anti-Semitism and the urgent need to find someone to blame. Terrible pogroms erupted. Entire communities and cities such as Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne were rounded up and burned alive in wooden homes or in town squares. The Black Death unleashed not only biological terror, but also the darkest sides of human behavior. It is wrong to think of the plague as only an urban problem, although cities were the epicenters. "90% of medieval Europe's population lived in rural areas. The plague spread there as well, carried by refugees escaping the towns, or traveling peddlers. The destruction in the countryside was slower, but perhaps even more significant in its long-term effects. Thousands of small villages, now lost to history, were entirely wiped out. The manorial system, which depended on a constant flow of peasant labor to work the Lord's land, ground to a standstill. Contemporary accounts describe haunting rural scenes, harvests decaying in the fields, with no one left to collect them, herds of sheep and cattle wandering without direction across the countryside, eventually becoming wild, or dying from abandonment. Because the shepherds were gone, wolves, emboldened by the absence of human activity, began moving closer to surviving settlements. The carefully maintained medieval landscape was slowly being reclaimed by nature. By 1350, the plague had reached the northern edges of the continent, Scotland, Scandinavia, and even the isolated settlements of Greenland, delivering a fatal blow to the Norse colonies. It had swept across the entire continent, from the warm Mediterranean to the frozen north. By 1351, the first catastrophic wave of the Black Death began to fade. The bacterium had simply exhausted its supply of vulnerable victims. The fog slowly lifted, revealing a transformed continent. The precise death toll will never be known, but modern historians estimate that between 75 and 200 million people perished across Eurasia and North Africa. In Europe alone, perhaps half of the population died within less than 5 years. The survivors stepped into a world that appeared familiar, but was fundamentally changed. The immediate aftermath brought economic disorder and intense inflation, but then something extraordinary occurred. The massive population loss created a severe shortage of labor. For the first time in centuries, peasants held bargaining power. Lords, desperate to have their lands cultivated, were forced to provide higher wages and improved conditions. The rigid system of serfdom fractured, and in many regions, eventually collapsed. The golden age of the laborer had begun. Born from devastation, psychological wounds ran deep. Art became fixated on death. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became a widespread motif, depicting skeletons leading kings, popes, and peasants alike toward the grave. A stark reminder that death was the ultimate equalizer. The Black Death was the greatest catastrophe Western civilization ever endured. It shattered the confidence of the High Middle Ages and exposed the fragility of human systems. Against the forces of nature, the society that rebuilt afterward became more cynical, more questioning, and forced to adapt. In the end, the path of destruction we have traced today cleared the foundation for the slow, painful rise of the modern world. For centuries, the Black Death was viewed as a distant medieval nightmare. Fear of the air itself. Does that truly sound like ancient history, or does it feel unsettlingly familiar? The plague was a test of civilization, and such tests have a way of returning